Hello and welcome again to another episode of the World Transformed Know Your Enemy series. We're very lucky to have Luke Nerona to speak to us today about a series of issues around state racism and different kinds of coercive force that might operate through state racism. I hope it's going to be quite a kind of relaxed but informative conversation, but it could go on for hours, but we'll try not to do that. Thanks so much for coming, Luke. I wondered if we might begin by maybe even just talking to each other a bit about what we mean when we say state racism, because in the course we've found often that when we talk about racism, people still go back to talking about the individual beliefs of people, their workmates or their neighbours, and quite kind of personal individual stuff. So I wondered if, like, reflecting on your work or work we've done together, you might say a little bit about what we're on about when we say about state racism rather than my neighbour is slightly bigoted.
Yeah, no, it's an important question. Thanks for having me, guys. I mean, throw me in at the deep end a bit there, but but I think it comes out of a frustration, I suppose, of people on all parts of the political spectrum kind of trying to reduce racism to sluggish skinheads or to the kind of frozen racism of those who are sort of backwards and take to the streets, march for the EDL or whoever the latest incarnation of that kind of party is, or the more recent idea that we're all a bit racist somewhere deep down and we need to sort of train it out of our unconscious biases. And to say that actually individuals kind of bigoted and intolerant reflexes aren't the main problem. What the problem is the kind of distribution of life chances, of dignity, of safety, and the ways in which that's patterned around certain ideas of infrahumanity, or gradations of people who aren't quite human or aren't seen to be deserving of full rights, or recognized as proper political subjects. I think when you have that in mind, that longer history of organizing the world into those who aren't properly human, then you look for the remnants of that and think about which kinds of people, which kinds of things can be done to particular kinds of people based on ideas about their inherent character or nature or something which is in them essentially, whether that's cultural, whether that's essential to their culture or whether that's essential to their biology or usually a toxic mix of both. We then are interested in how states are at the center of reproducing both practices and ideas which then do lead to your uncle being a bit racist and do mean that, of course, the police officer does have unconscious bias and, of course, mean that the kind of end point of that desire for the annihilation of the other does lead to fascism and other kinds of far-right street violence, etc. But the real question is, how does all this mess get reproduced? And one of the ways that we've talked about together and that I've looked at is immigration controls, a system of highly exclusive citizenship regimes which carve up the world and reproduce inequalities between people in different parts of the world, and particular forms of policing, particular relationships in school and employment, which basically mean that when you're an anti-racist, like in the ways that we've come to talk about, that's where you go. You don't go to the individual ideas or ideologies of biological superiority necessarily, or even intolerance and unconscious bias. You look somewhere else for, maybe it's laws, maybe it's state practices, maybe it's particular institutions to see what racism looks like.
You were talking a bit about the ways in which the state reproduces racialized categories and racist exclusion. And I think that's really helpful in terms of what we've been thinking about in the course about what is the right doing when it kind of uses its power to distribute resources or kind of coerce in certain places. And we're going through a very particular moment in Britain right now with quite an escalation of quite overtly racist laws, particularly around policing and around nationality and bordering, around a few other things as well, I think, are coming up. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about how we might begin to understand this particular conjuncture where, after having done not much governing in this moment of absolute crisis, Johnson didn't show up for Prime Minister's Question Time oh, but not in Parliament today. So it's a kind of whole, where is he kind of thing. But the actual measures of the state are really in steamroller mode of, in quite quick succession. These very draconian laws are being passed through. I wonder if you've got any thoughts about what might be at stake there or what they're trying to do.
Yeah, it's difficult because, I mean, to throw something back at you, which maybe you can reply when I get through my initial thoughts, is it's hard to work out what's kind of continuous and where the important ruptures are. I mean, the continuities are building on the terrible things. So the kinds of policies that Priti Patel is pushing through are consolidating, building from, exacerbating a set of practices that were already really bad, and we've already had a lot of, I would say, successive policies which make things worse around issues of policing, civil liberties, immigration, prisons, and they seem to be getting worse. So it's hard to know whether this represents, or which parts of these legislation represent the real significant change. So, for example, the citizenship stripping aspects of the Nationality and Borders Bill, which will be the act soon, seem terrible, and they are, because they say that you can strip someone's citizenship even more easily because you don't even have to tell them, notify them when you are doing. But when you look into it, or the brief reading I've done on it, that's a response to a legal case in the High Court where the Home Office were challenged on the fact that they often have old addresses, and the judgment said, of course, you have to try and let them know, and maybe you have to try a bit harder than just sending it to an address if you know that's old or something like that. And the response was, well, we don't even want to have to do that. So we want to be able to do it without letting anyone know. So there's a lot of this kind of, some of the backstory is quite messy responses to having what they seem to, what the government and the executive seem to feel is having their wings clipped by legal determinations, and then responding by closing that gap. And that's what we mean by something like authoritarianism and something like the extension of the executive power. But it's not fascism proper, right? It's a particular, and you can go through the history of case law around citizenship stripping and see that process constantly going on from 2002 onwards. And it picks up in 2010 with the Tories. But it's really also, it's a war on terror, Blairite kind of initiative to make it possible, more to make it more easy to strip people of citizenship. So I think, while I'm very troubled by these sets of legislation, which I think represent exactly anything we might mean by reactionary right-wing kind of government with a huge mandate and power, trying to delegitimize the idea of separation of powers under a liberal nation state. Who knows when we get out of something like a liberal state and into something else? But it's not clear that that's been accelerated that much necessarily. There's a lot of signposting of things that are happening and a lot of worrying things. But when you look back at what it builds on, you think, and I'm maybe wasn't paying attention enough, but that there have been kind of losses like this all the way from very different governments. And so I'm still heartened by the fact that Kill the Bill, which perhaps is more of a rupture, the police sentencing crime courts bill, I can't remember the full name, has met with such resistance and will continue to be in the protests upcoming. So I think I'm always trying to work through the fact that we both have a very distressing situation where the Tory party seem to have a huge mandate, and maybe will for a while, doing what they promised by sucking the energy out of the far right and bringing it right into the center of their policies and their legislation. And yet, substantively, it's not clear how some of these things will be implemented, and some of the resistance is really exciting, and the street politics, I don't think, has gone away for long. It didn't with the pandemic, the BLM protests. I don't think issues around climate are going to keep people off the streets for very long. We'll come to talk about perhaps the Nationality and Borders Bill, which obviously is more my area, and I think does have elements that are really, really, really worrying. But again, building on a lot of previous 30 years of terrible awful, seemingly worsening policy, and not many gains in terms of those concerned with migrant rights.
No, I really hear what you're saying. And I guess you've heard me say this before, but I think partly our job as people who want to build a better world is both to understand the onward trajectory of the right, but also maintain an ability to be constantly surprised by their innovation. Because there's a kind of left cynicism, isn't there, about, oh, there's never anything new because the right has always done this. And that can quickly turn into a kind of quietism, because where we don't recognize the kind of responsive positioning that you're describing and how we can then position ourselves. Because it's like, oh, how stupid of you, the Tories have always been racist, and look what they did in 72 isn't much different from what they did in 81, isn't much different from what they did in 93, isn't much different from then. And although that, of course, there's a kernel of truth in that, in the ways that you've described and what we've done together has described, it's also only one level of the analysis, because there's always this kind of battle of contestation, as you say, both legally and in the street, and within their own forces as well, because there's contestation within the Tory party, even about what kind of racist they want to be. It's all happening at the same time. And I think it's important for us to both kind of be able to position state actions within longer trajectories, so we kind of understand the points at which they're pressure and points at which they're responding, but also to kind of be alert to when they slow down or speed up or try something different, or even when they, or just to kind of be open that every battle in the war is a new battle, it feels. And that I'm just really aware of the ways that, you know, academics in particular can be too pleased with the way that, you know, I'm thinking about myself, not about you, but everyone, that, oh yes, we know all the answers of this because I already wrote that book 20 years ago, and look, it's the same book is happening, as if saying that somehow fixes it. But our job is to understand, okay, when we get our collective learning, what then? What do we do? As you say, look, why is a new movement possible now? Which is a whole kind of set of strange movements have made Kill the Bill possible, perhaps, like unexpected things. Who would have thought that Sisters Uncut would be the leading player in pushing back against the coercive state? And, you know, it's quite a big set of linkages from forming a street movement against austerity, targeting the cutting back of domestic violence services, to becoming a leading player in, well, how do you form a coalition to say that authoritarianism hits us all? Now, I don't think the right could have predicted that. I don't think the left predicted it, but something has happened in those bits. So it's more about, I think, kind of trying to always be open to understanding how much labour and effort and innovation and chance the other side are having to operate with as well, because that's also kind of part of the game. It's not our job to big them up to make them seem invincible. They're doing that themselves for us. But I hear what you're saying about immigration law, that if you look through the history of immigration law, it does feel like every small instance where people could remain human, oh, we spotted that, we'll take that from you.
Mm-hmm.
Be able to go to the shops, we'll take that from you. Used to be able to access this, oh, used to be able to work even, you can't take that from you. It's kind of, but I think that the street battle on that is very uncertain, that, because of how ordering works in people's everyday lives doesn't seem so clear cut to me that that's the same populist call that it might have been 20 years ago. But I might be wrong. I guess who are they talking to, I guess, is the question. Sorry, I lost my track. But I guess who is the audience for these performances then?
Yeah, I mean, seemingly, some of the stuff around asylum is very, and this question has been for me since I first started thinking about politics of immigration, has been, what's the relationship between the tabloids, the government, I mean, the Home Office in particular, and kind of popular anger or resentment, because it's never, I always find it hard to know whether it's the Home Office press release that starts the story, the far right standing on the shore watching out for the boats, or the kind of press hounding down on every single legal case, every single foreign offender who doesn't get deported. Who knows where it begins? But that's been going on for a long time, and in a way, I think this government in particular feels that by punishing, and I think there are significant changes in the Nationality and Borders Bill. I think there's stuff around anyone who arrives, if they can make it workable. And I don't know if they're kind of planning towards one more comprehensive foul swoop where legal appeals become impossible, because they already make it really hard, and they're running up against the kind of a fundamental barrier presented by having separation of powers and having an independent judiciary. You know, they say the lawyers are lefties, they say that judges are liberal, they leave the EU, they say Human Rights Act, we should get rid of that. Maybe they will, but increasingly they're just pushing so that, you know, that some of these ideas that only people who wait patiently in a camp can claim asylum, and anyone who arrives by any other means can be put in prison for 4 years. I mean, they won't enforce that en masse, but they will do selectively, probably like with the police. With the protest parts of the policing bill, they'll enforce it selectively. Not everyone who could be forced to create a nuisance will be sentenced to 10 years, but some people will, you know, and you've seen that around the Colston 4, and some of the backlash to them getting off. That I think there'll be test cases, and there'll be, even if the scope of actually enforcing criminal law against everyone who arrives and claims asylum, or everyone who has a protest, won't be realistic. So I do think there's a lot of their audience being one they're maybe partly imagined, partly focus groups that they try and symbolically appeal to, even though actually in practice, some of the stuff in the Nationality and Borders Bill and some of the stuff around protests, it's hard to imagine how they'll enforce it sweepingly. But I mean, who knows? They might just expand the prisons even more, the detention centres even more. I think it's always important for all of us to look at how the law looks, you know, the press release around the legislation, what the law looks like in practice, what goes on in the courts, and also all the cases that don't make it, because it's long been true that in immigration control, there's a lot of criminal statute on the books that they can use, but they tend to find it easy. If they can use administrative powers to lock someone up and deport them, they'll do that. And also they you know, austerity to some extent affects some of these institutions too, even if that's not advertised.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's really interesting about, and as you say, that some of it's performative. You know, it's theatrics, isn't it? It's political theatrics that is kind of, and that's for a particular audience. And in some ways, the fact that some of the framing of this proposed legislation seems unworkable. You know, even for people who are not our allies who are going to have to administer it, saying, "How are you going to do this?" It's what that's neither here nor there. I wondered if within that part where the core of a popular nationalism might be, like if part of, especially around all the statue stuff and bordering stuff, and even I feel like Kill the Bill had this whole, all of the bill has this kind of idea of the unruly protester who is somehow disrespectful of our national traditions. That seems so much part of as if, you know, we have to have the policing bill because look at the statue of Churchill, look at what's going on. And I wondered if you thought that there is some kind of remaking of a popular nationalist narrative in this performance stuff that we're living through.
I mean, I think there is, but one of the things we talked about trying to write the book that we worked on together, Empire's Endgame, is the extent to which it does gather a majority of any kind, or whether, I mean, it clearly a kind of rightist culture war around some key issues can win elections, but whether it actually builds a majority is another question. And I wonder if just the constant summoning of this kind of clash, where you know that as the kind of respectable person who thinks Churchill's statue should stand, and who's always been worried about, you know, urban decline, and who doesn't want to give any more money to people on welfare, and who thinks there's too many immigrants, and etc. That the kind of constant summoning of this hydra-headed kind of enemy of, you know, protesters and hippies and queers and black young people on the streets, and the headlines about knife crime constantly. And then I think we do have to think about, and I don't know if even the paper's the right place to look anymore, but maybe it's Facebook. But if you read through the paper and just think about all the stories together, again, trying to think about what world is summoned for the people who are being appealed to. I don't know if it's got any positive content in it really anymore. It's only that the only reason anyone gives a shit about Churchill in this instance is not because they actually know anything about or are asked to actually think about the history of the war or defeating fascism or something like that. It's just that that kind of crew of people who are against everything we stand for are after it, are going to write he was a racist, and maybe they think I'm a racist too. So I think which I think leads to very disturbing kinds of political formation and energy and anger and violence and desire for oppression, things we talk about. I think the kinds of political subjects it produces, the kind of affects it produces, are dangerous, but they're not coherent either, which, this is why the kind of fascism that we're up against requires all of us on the left to think about very hard, because it's not, you can't just go and read the books about the 30s and find it there. It's something else. So I think that's part of it, which is that all of these stories, it's not clear whether there are more people who are for or against, and maybe that animates them even more because they sort of know that, people under 50 voted for Corbyn on the whole, that universities by their very nature are kind of that the arguments of the right don't work very well, that young people even if they do turn out for BLM protests and do feel animated by that all over the country, in towns all over the country, the people who are most exciting on our screens, whether football, music, comedy, or whatever it might be, I mean, there's very few space for it is black and brown people and young people and women and queers, and so yeah, I mean, maybe I'm getting lost in a kind of cultural point, but I think that the way that plays out in terms of whether this government is creating a new kind of national popular is not clear to me, because I think they know that the certain demographic trends are against them, and that maybe makes them battle even harder to create doubt and anger and skepticism and anti-politics, as much as a kind of politics of a nation where we can all get behind and defend something that we know what that is. I don't think it exists very clearly other than in the negative.
No, I think that's, you know very well that I very much agree with that, and that I was speaking to another colleague about a similar set of issues, and that someone of my age was saying, oh yes, it's, the right wins because of nationalism. And I was saying, well, that might work for people above a certain age, but for younger people, there is no, as you say, there's no positive call. And instead of a positive call, what you have is an experience of precarious work, indebtedness, lifetime indebtedness if you want to be educated, or even if not, no hope of stable housing, a climate crisis that you are afraid of, but decision makers appear to be ignoring or postponing because they'll be dead, and a day-to-day life that is much more materially unpredictable and unrewarding, or cannot be relied on. And again, alongside those kinds of things, I think, and what you offer me is a chance to stand by the Churchill statue. It's just not enough stickiness to make a national narrative there, is there? It's not enough of an offer to people who are not already quite old. And then, but that, I also think you're right, that the non-offer, some of it then goes to people come to our side, but some of it kind of is an unknown energy, which is going who knows where, and perhaps none of us yet know where, but that there's something dangerous in the air, isn't there, to give people nothing, to make their lives harder, to have apparently functioning political institutions that only can do the theatre of politics, not any practical kind of distribution of the things that people need in their lives, in a pandemic as well. So everyone knows that, who didn't know that before. That does feel like, the spectre of anti-politics feels like just an open target for different kinds of actors who may be emerging almost at any point. Do you think, oh, I shouldn't say this miserable stuff? Do you see what I mean? Like,
Yeah, no,
could be new monsters, but there could be new monsters, and there's a kind of happiness about that.
I'll run with the miserable stuff, and then we can draw out of it towards the end. But yeah, I mean, some of it goes to places. I mean, I sometimes just think there's a lot of pain and suffering that can be absorbed into something which isn't actually political, which is people bear it on their own and in their own networks and their own families. So I think there's a lot of that happening in all of the things you describe as that. There's a gap between punishing people in that way and the false promises and shit work and uncertainty, and then something like politics, which either goes towards us or towards the right. I think a lot of it does. Maybe you'd say it goes in. There's lots of cultural things that are interesting that are happening, like I don't know, sort of self-making around the ways in which people have to hustle and do 4 or 5 things at once, but that becomes a big part of how they present and their identity and how they manage to make a living and make money. Kind of new agey things which aren't necessarily political. There's lots of directions that it goes in. I think that fortunately for us, I do still feel like a lot of the people who are in the generation for whom the promises of kind of job and salary and home don't seem real anymore. I do feel like more of those energies are going to, if anywhere political, towards our side, and I think that's a good thing. And I think one of the things we can see from the, I mean, it's hard not to reflect on the failed Corbyn project, because I think one of the reasons all sorts of people got involved in that, many of who were previously involved in social movements or anti-racists who wouldn't have necessarily been involved in the Labour Party, was because of the felt need for some institutional structure with which to provide something for people to channel some of their energies and something to bounce off and struggle against, but in a conversation that's not just hostile. And that was exciting. And unfortunately, we now have the government who won there in power and doing, wreaking havoc and doing the things they're doing. But it's interesting to me, and we've talked about this before, that some of the things that were difficult for the Labour Party under Corbyn to kind of triangulate their way out of, like, should we say more cops or not? What should we say about EU migration? How do we deal with the arguments about labour markets and about migrants from Eastern Europe? And what on earth do we say about Brexit? Are we Lexiters or what? All of these things, in some ways, while I don't think the street politics against racist immigration controls is quite as lively as it should be, the response to police terror in the US and then transposing that to here, the kind of shared learning that went on about histories of Black resistance in particular to police violence and police killings quite quickly. And I think organizations like Sisters Uncut and many others were involved in that. That meant then by the time we had the police crime sentencing bill, that certain kinds of connections were made possible also by debates within and among feminists around sex work and criminalization and what to do about endemic male violence and what kinds of solutions and problems and other kinds of ways of thinking about justice and abolition. The fact that they were already in motion by people who are active and making compelling arguments is fascinating, because I think they have a much wider appeal than we could have ever imagined a few years ago. And I think that actually the base of people who were involved in the politics of the Labour Party, primarily in wanting the Labour Party to win and arguing over internal politics of the Labour Party, is rivaled perhaps by those who think it's really important to think about how the police work and what the police are doing, and whose primary political points of orientation in the last few years have been around trans-exclusionary radical feminism, around people being locked up, around stop and search, around and again, I think there should be more connecting that to the Nationality and Borders Bill and everything that's in that, but still people are trying to make those connections. And that, I just think that's really I think it's really interesting for where we're at and what's possible, even though, unfortunately, I think all of those things would be strengthened by more institutional structures and places to channel things, and not just kind of reading very good social media posts, which are important, but I think sometimes we don't know what to do with the knowledge that we're building among ourselves, other than wait for the next time we're all going to be on the street together. I don't know where the other outlets are, because we're all up against it in the institutions which we might have done politics in, and we feel in a point of weakness. And union, well, not all unions are in a point of weakness. I'm in UCU, so we're currently struggling but trying to find energy. So I think that's a hard thing to make sense of. In seeming institutional weakness, historic failures of the left, part like a disillusionment with the Labour Party for many, and yet it's not going to be long before, I don't think that historic numbers of people in the streets were a one-off in 2020. I don't think that. I think it's going to keep coming, and the demands seem more and more articulate and complex for the ones that I've been participating in.
No, absolutely. And I also think that not that it's come to fruition, but a quite widespread understanding that having a political project which almost solely rests around hoping you'll capture the state temporarily through a general election is not sufficient institutional building practice for our side. So there are different kinds of experiments, a resurgence of different cooperative activity, a resurgence of local municipal activity, a resurgence of thinking about what is institution building for people who want to remake the world. And that's the kind of periodic process, I think, across the left within Britain and globally. But it feels, because of the ways in which, I don't normally say this, but in which a kind of neoliberal moment remade what states could be and shifted around what electoral politics could be, not only here, but in many places. There are many points at which people are saying, okay, well, what are the things that we need to put in place in order for our ideas to have a materiality, to be able to sustain us, that our mutual practice might be able to sustain life, so that we are forming a kind of defensive structure around ourselves so that our lives can thrive, rather than always postponing the point at which we'll start living to the point at which the day after the election. And I think that's much better, isn't it? That's much better for all of us, because none of us can afford to be waiting till the day after the election. So there's something in that moment of energy. Not that we know the answer yet, but I think you're right. There's a kind of, the massing is part of the move towards that, about, okay, and then what, now we are in the mass, what does it mean to remake our world? But I'm terribly kind of deeply, hopelessly optimistic about our capacity to remake the world for ourselves. Can't help myself. What can I do?
No, I'm glad you are. Otherwise, if I had a different kind of anti, then I'd end up in a different kind of place. But I mean, yeah, it's always, you said this, but the hopelessness kind of circle, the kind of hopefulness, the despair kind of circles the hopefulness, doesn't it? And you have to find a way to deal with both of those things. But I think the question of trying to work out how the change is coming is always difficult, because you're always surprised, and working out whether you're a kind of person who thinks about this scale or that scale seems hopeless too, because we all, well, not all of us, but most of us got sucked into the Corbyn project, even those who told me they never would. I saw them there in the cold door knocking. So that's just how it goes.
It's really funny and also kind of so sweet and delicious.
Yeah.
People who died in the wool anti-electoralists, suddenly see them out shamefully door knocking. You think, well, there's something going on in that kind of, it's like a romance, a family romance, a kind of openness to, I don't believe in love anymore, but I cannot not be sucked into this moment of collective romance. And I think that's a beautiful thing about ourselves to each other, that the left always has to have that. And now it has to have it the other way. So people who devoted their lives to electoralism have to be open to the unloveness of community-based building. And
Definitely, yeah, totally. And I mean, I think not necessarily having the being dogmatic or thinking that you know. I certainly don't feel like I know whether the people doing the small scale, most radical modeling of an alternative way, or the people who are fighting for within institutions of different kinds, including the Labour Party, for example. I don't know who's going to make the most change. I know that, but we should kind of be generous to one another, you know, once we can, you know, in comradely fashion. And if we feel like we can trust one another, then seeing in good faith the different strategies people take, because we need more of us doing different kinds of things. And I've never been sure enough that I have the answer, even though I move between scales for different kinds of things and think sometimes you might want to push for one kind of thing, and another time you might have nothing other to say, other to do or to say than, you know, supporting an individual and, you know, trying to stop an immigration raid or something like that. And maybe the question of whether you can scale that up is the wrong question, but sometimes maybe it's the right kind of question, and it's difficult to work through.
I think that's a lovely place to end on, really, about how our need to continue to be open and comradely to each other. It's just us, isn't it? There's no one else. Yeah. Thanks so much for your time, Luke. It's lovely to speak to you.
Yeah, see you soon.